Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So this month we're gonna be talking about the August crop check, U.S. yields, and the season ahead. I will let our wonderful speakers introduce themselves in a minute, but before that, quick notes: we are recording, and everyone who registered gets the replay. And drop your questions in the Q&A section anytime. We'll get to them at the end. So, Joao, handing off to you.
Thanks, Rosanna. Welcome everyone to the monthly Helios webinar. On this edition, we're gonna talk about the U.S. crop, the U.S. corn and soybeans crop, and what we are expecting for the South American crop amid El Nino, geopolitical tensions, and a year that has been marked with lots of volatility. I'm Joe Marciani, senior market analyst at Helios, and today I have the honor to have Tori Alden as our guest. Tori, from Round Lake Commodities. If you could do a quick introduction for us, Tori, it would be really, really nice.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks everybody for attending, and Joao, I really appreciate you hosting me. I am somebody that has done this for a very long time. I guess I've done this in a lot of different roles, but most recently I worked with Joao at Fast Markets, and so I'm happy that we're able to get back together and do this for sure.
Very cool. So today, what we should expect from our webinar, we'll try to not be death by PowerPoint. I want to make this session more of a conversational tone and more of a informal chat between two analysts and comparing our views, what we agree with each other. So you guys should expect the way that we are organizing this. We're gonna talk a little bit about the U.S. season, what what's going on, what we should expect for the end of the season. Then we're gonna talk a little bit about the demand layer on the U.S. And then we're heading south to South America to talk about the handoff of the crop on Brazil and Argentina. What should expect, and by the end we'll have a couple of minutes for Q&A. Feel free. We love to take questions. Tori love to get these really, really trick questions. So please do your best to corner this guy. It's not easy to do it, I gotta tell you.
It's actually pretty easy, but bring it. I love questions for sure.
So I'd like to start. I think a good way to start this conversation will be talking about the U.S. and the August WASD. It has been quite interesting crop. We have wheat on the worst crop in I don't know how many decades. Soybeans marked by the geopolitical tensions between U.S. and China. China have been buying some U.S. beans in the past months, but this discussion, it's not something that it's done and that we actually have an answer for what we should expect for the coming years. And something that really caught my attention on the WASDE report was on the August WASDE was that the USDA cut it by 3 bushels per acre their yields on corn, but at the same time they capped as it was the soybean yields. So we ran our data, and I think in the end of the day, it is related to the phenology of the plants and how they deal with climate stress. So the season started quite warm there in the U.S., right, Tori?
It
Warm and
did.
dry, but
I mean, it's been kind of weird. It hasn't been a season where you see like lots of reports about drought, although it has been hot and it's been stressful. And I think the Helios Whopper index is good at identifying these issues in these kind of markets, right? Because it is, and I've spent half my time over the past year sort of building something and half paying attention to the markets, but it doesn't seem like weather has been as much of an issue or substantially more on the market's mind than it usually is during the summer, which is odd a little bit, I guess. And again, maybe some of that is just because I've had my nose buried in cloud a bit. But you had sort of one of the things that I've talked about over the years, and the example I give is the best way to make a really good soybean crop is to stress it a little bit at the beginning of the year and then dump water on it when it's filling pods, because it tells the plant early in the season you don't need to focus your energy on building a big beautiful canopy. You need to focus your energy on filling those pods. And so from that perspective, the soybean move from USDA makes sense. At the same time, the heat came during silking for corn, which makes it tough for the pollen to attach and to generate enough grain, enough spots for grain on the ear of corn, essentially. So one, I think that's why you see kind of the difference there between the two. And if you look back at similar years for weather, and again, I think this is because of the way that Helios does the four risk factors and the division up into the different stages of the plant's lifetime. I think it's good and interesting. You can kind of go back and investigate the corn crop through each of the stages, and it gives you a different kind of indication other than just watching the rainfall totals and the temperatures every day. But it does kind of make sense. Now, when we were getting ready for this, we were looking at some precip maps, right? And so it does also at the same time, while I can say this seems like a relatively decent setup for soybeans, or at least one that doesn't suggest big yield cuts are in the future unless the rain shuts off. If you look at kind of the 180-day departure from normal temp or precip and the last couple of weeks, there's a big green belt right across the heart of the corn belt. And so there should be sufficient soil moisture at the very least, and particularly for soybeans, which wouldn't have suffered the same damage that corn plants would have during pollination because of the overnight heat. But from a production perspective, it's always a little interesting to me too, in that I think in this year is probably not a great one, but I don't think that we've had just sort of a perfect year to see what yields could actually be, to kind of get the trend line well established. And I always feel like my trend line yields are either a little low or a little lower than low relative to what the potential is. But I don't know that we've seen it, because it seems like every year for the past 5 years or so, we've had some little issue that hasn't given us kind of, oh, this is going to be a really, really big crop. In places, yes. And I think as we shift our focus to South America, talking about Brazil, which produces record crops after record crops, will help solve some of that and fill in some of those holes. But I still think that I guess I still am scared from a conversation that I had sort of like 4 years ago with a guy from a seed company, and he was just saying, "Oh, the technology's really taken off." And
I was gonna mention SIDTech. It's moving the train line, right? And it's giving a buffer for all the crops to deal with climate stress, like quite different from like a decade ago, I would say.
It does, and I think there are the traits that they put into the genetics specifically to deal with drought or whatever kind of weather conditions they want to target. But then there are also sort of secondary effects of some of the other traits. And so I remember there was a year back when I first started, and it had been relatively dry, like this year, kind of, maybe drier a little bit. Yields were really good. And so my boss and I called up a seed company, and we were talking to them about why they thought the yields were better. And they said, well, one of the things that we found is that they were at that point they were changing the genetics to fight the corn borer pest, and the corn borer pest attacks fruits and probably other things. And if somebody is a farmer and actually knows what they do better than I do, I wouldn't argue with you. But anyway, one of the secondary effects of getting the plant's genetics in shape to battle that pest was that it made the root system more robust. And so they said we were sort of pleasantly surprised this year because the corn borer stuff rolled out. It was a little dry, but yields performed better than they did. So to your point, they and have been for 25 years now, kind of constantly improving this stuff. And I imagine that they're really, really good at it now. However, I think it doesn't eliminate, and I don't know that they ever will eliminate the weather risk, right? I think you can have events and beyond sort of the weather. You've been talking about the impact of fertilizer and in the changes in the fertilizer market. That on top of it then can still have an impact, even if you do have good yields year in and year out, despite the weather. And I haven't run the math on this, but I would almost argue even that if you had trendline yields going forward, demand is so robust right now for both corn and soybeans in the U.S. that it would be hard for the trend line to keep up with the demand on some level if you didn't have the weather variability.
No, I'm with you, and I'm something that it's quite interesting this year that I have been talking a lot on reports and clients is specific events and its asymmetry on its impact. So we had the Strait of Hormuz; it impacted the market quite asymmetrically. Within one market, the impacts are asymmetrical. And I think this chart also shows us and the difference between the yield cuts from corn in beans. So we had the same event. We have heat a little bit start of the season, kind of a bit drier than expected, and they impact yields on an asymmetrical way, which I honestly, and this is me kind of an eggs nerd, being an eggs nerd, but this is something that makes this markets quite fascinating for me. Like, you cannot take for granted one event and treat it as just one equal impact for across the markets.
I think that's true, and just one other thing that I'll slip in real quick by way of sort of preview, I think, is that not only can it be asymmetric, right, but it can also, and I think we'll talk a little bit about this, people's expectation for what a weather event means, people's expectations built around El Nino may be a little bit different than the actual impacts of El Nino.
Yeah. Let's move forward. So yeah, this is just a print from the WASI report. I mean, it was an interesting one, not an eventful one. The August WASI is always interesting to get the first yield surveys on the print. It has moved the market. And I have a question for you, actually, Tori. So we have seen some movements like corn read at 4% on the WASI day. Beans move it a little bit higher, not as high as corn and wheat. Do you still think there are some steam for the next WASI report, maybe, or another event to keep this rally going? Or do you think that the crop's done and there isn't much room to any surprises?
I think one of the differences between the August WASDE and the SEP WASDE, as you said, the August WASDE is the first to incorporate surveys from farmers, and then the SEP WASDE is the first to incorporate the objective yield survey data. And so I think the August WASDE probably confirmed to people some of their darker fears. And I also think either way, both the U.S. corn market and the U.S. soybean market, although the U.S. soybean market a little bit more than the corn market, are in a situation where, and I'll just use soybeans because it's much simpler. any change in production or supply is going to come out of exports in my balance sheet.
Yeah. Mm,
So the supply is tight enough, even at relatively large levels, right? That I'm just basically cutting exports if I cut soybean production. Corn is not quite that way, but given that cattle prices, I bought some hamburger this morning for my dog, and I can't believe how much I paid for it. Cattle prices remain high, so corn feeding is still in demand, and ethanol is steady, but it's there. And with gas at $4, ethanol is worth more than it is when gas is at $2, obviously. And so I don't think that from a demand perspective, you're going to get a whole lot of potential downside risk. And in fact, I talk about this. These markets often confound me because I look at all the big supply and I get really excited and I put my forecast down, and then the demand just keeps grinding on and grinding on and grinding on, and the prices don't really fall. And that feels like the kind of markets that we're in now. Not that they can't go down. And if the September WASDE resolves the yield question in a way that reflects more of the longer term departure from normal rainfall data than it does the heat data, you could get the market to reverse and go down, although I don't know that you have sort of a huge sell-off and we're going down to test $3 or something like that, because again, I think the demand is just there, and in soybeans it's even more pronounced, and we're already sort of close to or at pipeline levels. And I think there is in some respects, as an analyst, it's hard if you can't cut your demand projections that much, right? If you really believe in your demand projections, that yield number is going to probably hang out someplace where that all works, not because you want to do it wrong, but because you want to make it all kind of work out right. And given the improvements in genetics and that kind of thing, that there is some upside for yield. And the fact that this isn't a year where they're showing desert across Iowa, basically, on the evening news every night.
Yeah. All right. So this is our print for corn vapor, our climate stress index. So we should expect a hot week, actually next week. But as you said, I'm with you, and our prints also have the same point to the same view that we don't really have much room for big surprises supply wise. Of course, 2026 has been fulfilled with surprises, but not from the agronomics of the market. It's more of like overseas and geopolitical issues, and mostly oil in the end of the day. Let's move forward to what actually makes price. So, and as you said, supply has been making the headlines. We have been hearing about this Godzilla El Nino, about the doomsday that will follow up with this super strong El Nino, which is appealing. It makes sense, and I think that's why it makes the headlines. But actually, what is pricing the markets is demand. And when we move to corn, the US has a balance sheet that's kind of not super tight. The export space, there you guys are exporting a lot, but at the same time, I don't see much room to for a tightening of the supply.
Well, and I think you could almost, for 26, 27, you could almost pick an ending stocks number and then adjust your exports to make that fit, right? I think for corn, it's not quite the same obvious conclusion that Brazil would fill in any exports that the U.S. doesn't ship in the same way that it is for soybeans, probably. But as I go through this and I look at that number, that is certainly one of the easier numbers to change, I think, without a big sort of, I know Brazil will step in the back end of it. So it's kind of a tight market, and I think your point is right that if you do get additional cuts or big cuts to the yield and to supply, corn could get a lot more interesting, and you could see corn prices continue to rally. Conversely, if the September data sort of ends up suggesting that yield should be higher, then again, I don't know that the strong demand lets prices go down to $3 or anything. And in fact, it may be tough for them to get back down to test 4 or even 450. There's 450 on here, that's a cash price. But I mean, and on a futures basis, the demand side, particularly again, the feed demand is not going anywhere in the US, and the ethanol demand is steady, but it's going to stay there. I think for corn, really 25, 26, 26, 27, the US still is the residual exporter kind of to the world, but I do think that South America will become more and more of that. And I think that Brazil in particular looks like a country that will become more of a larger player, not that they're already a huge player, obviously, but a larger and more significant player in the export markets that they have always participated in, but haven't dominated as much as they do soybeans right now, for example.
Yeah. So we had the new RFS, this huge volumes for the RVOs, and it's something that is interesting because if you read the RFS set 2 of the document, it doesn't mention even on sustainability concerns. What it mentions is, let's keep our energy supply resilient. Let's make it as resilient as we can and stronger to external shocks. And now we had, and moving forward to March, we had the war. The war started with Israel and Iran, which spiked crude oil above $100 per barrel, and it gave, like, if you look through a global lens, it gave like a new push forward to it basically strengthened the biofuels argument, right? And in the US, we have been hearing since last year lots of discussions on the E15. Do you think this scenario of war, of oil constraints, although oil moved back to the 80s, it's not on the pre-war, it's still not above, it's still above pre-war levels. Do you think that gives a bit more strength on the argument towards E15? Is it gonna become something, and should we expect any major changes on the corn ethanol demand in the US?
So they have been trying to get E15 going in the US for as long as I can remember, certainly for as long as the ethanol industry has existed. Yeah. And I don't mean that to say that it's a ridiculous proposal to have E15, if there's any reason that we shouldn't have E15, other than kind of this. The ethanol market is an economically based market. There's a renewable fuel standard, but the implied ethanol mandate is 15 billion gallons, and we won't produce 15 billion gallons of ethanol this year. And so that tells you that ethanol producers aren't producing to a mandate, they're producing to an economic demand, which is octane booster, because in the US we can't use the old octane booster anymore. The old octane was phased out 10, 20 years ago. And so I think that right now there is a big push on E15, in part because of the war and energy security. And I remember having a conversation with you about soybeans is sort of a strategic energy reserve, and government starting to look at crops in some sense as a strategic energy reserve. And I don't know that that anybody does that yet, but I do think that's sort of a correct way to think about it. And if that is the government's, if that's the government's purpose, or if that's its policy that it wants to do energy security, then E15 makes a lot of sense from that perspective. Now, I think there would be pushback because you get it has a lower vapor pressure, so it's not as clean for the environment in some respects. It gets lower gas mileage and other things that make it not as popular as some as gasoline, I suppose. But I do think that there could be this argument made that that these biofuel programs, not only do they provide benefits to the environment, but they also do provide an energy security layer that is hard to get anywhere else, and almost anybody can have as long as they grow crops. And corn in the U.S. is turned into ethanol, but a lot of other places use other things. Brazil uses primarily sugar, although increasingly corn too, and in Europe uses wheat. And so from an energy security perspective, I think E15 makes all the sense in the world. Whether they can get it through or not, I think will depend on probably, like a lot of things right now, how the rest of the war in Iran goes and whether it drags out and gas goes to $6 or whatever. I think if you get if you get continued upward pressure in gasoline prices, it starts to make it easier to consider E15. But given the changes they made in set two to the biomass-based diesel mandates, which were a little bit more than I would have guessed going into them, maybe they will be.
Yeah, and speaking about them, speaking about the demo, let's talk a little bit about beans, because this has been the major change in the market in the US, right? Like we see on the set to this huge increase in the BBD demand. There was the withdrawal of the indirect land use charge from the 45Z for those that are not familiar with the biofuel industry. So in the US in 2025 switched from a blender tax credit, which was a flat credit, $8 per gallon per gallon of biofuel produced. So blenders, biodiesel, yeah, on biomass-based diesel production. So producers and blenders would get $8 flat independently from the feedstock that they use it to produce their biofuel. Then in 2025, it switched to the new 45Z, which was a credit based on the carbon intensity of the feedstock you use it in the biofuel production, which made initially soybeans way less appealing than they were compared to the low carbon intensity feedstocks such as used cooking oil, tallow, poultry fat, all the waste products that has a lower CI, and therefore they would generate more credits under the 45Z scheme. That helped for a bit. That also tanked veg oil demand by the biomass-based diesel industry in early 2025. But then I think it was something in line with the political atmosphere in the US, something like let's make soybean oil great again, let's make farmers happy again. And on top of that, we had the Chinese demand as well. The US wasn't exporting anything. So I think that gave some push to the withdrawal of the ILUC, the indirect land use charge, which was a penalty on the carbon intensity of soybean oil. When the administration withdrew that, it made soybean oil as competitive as these lower carbon intensity feedstocks on credit generation under the 45Z, which was a huge transformation because in the end of the day, those low CI feedstocks, they are waste products. You're not raising a cow, you're not feeding a cow to produce beef tallow. You're raising a cow to produce Tori's dog's hamburgers. So there's a supply constraint on that. You're not growing more cows to get more tallow, and that's why these markets were so exposed to international trade flows. So that was a huge change, and that's the justification of this chart and this huge spike on soy oil demand by the biofuel industry. And now my question for you, Tori, is on your view, why are you nearly 1.1.5 billion pounds below the USDA number? And I think your original number was a little bit even lower than that. So can you walk us through a little bit of the what you're seeing on the current scenario, on the trade flows, on this political layer of the biofuel industry, and why you have this view a little bit lower than USDA?
So the way that I used to do this allocation was essentially I had a big list of all of the facilities, and we had some assumption about what each facility's feedstock mix was, and then I went through and sort of hand balanced all of these things against each other and against the balance sheets and against all of the other feedstocks, and then finally against the yields per gallon of fuel produced. And for the first, I don't know, 3 or 4 years of the ramp up in the renewable diesel capacity, I tended to run above USDA's numbers. USDA would be at 12, and I would be at kind of 13 or something. And usually it would sort of end up somewhere in the middle. I'd like to say closer to mine, but if I went back through the numbers, that might not be true. But that's my recollection anyway. And so the initial 45Z really penalized soybean oil, and then there was some the ILUC changes that you talked about. It made soybean oil competitive from a CI score standpoint in the 45Z credit, and so there has to be some allocation back. I think where I differ from USDA is sort of less in the soybean oil, although it shows up in the soybean oil, but it's more in the lower CI feedstocks where I am probably higher for a couple of reasons. One, for some of USDA's data, I don't really take their production numbers, or they don't give us a production number. UCO is one area where they don't really give us a production number, and so I have a number that may be different than what USDA publishes, because they don't really publish a used cooking oil balance sheet, or at least not that I've seen. And so that's likely one of the areas. The other thing that's going on, I think, is that the demand, as we've talked about, has been so robust. And one of the things that I've spent some time over the last year doing is breaking down the non-biofuel demand for all of these feedstocks and looking at the economics for the various uses of those. And so even though there's always kind of this battle between the mandated soybean oil demand or the mandated feedstock demand and the traditional demand, or the non-biofuel demand, the way that I talk about it is I always say, in the end, the mandated demand is mandated, and so they will have to buy that and turn it into fuel. There are a bunch of caveats on that. You can meet obligations with RINs from prior years. You can carry obligations over, and all kinds of things that make that not quite as true as it would seem. But it does seem like, in addition to the mandate, you also have credits, which make the economics of turning soybean oil into biodiesel, renewable diesel, different than buying soybean oil to turn into shampoo or mayonnaise or something. But nobody's given up mayonnaise so that we can have biomass-based diesel. And so those guys also still need to buy what they have always bought, essentially. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I put a little bit more weight on the biofuel guys, particularly in soybean oil and particularly Midwest biodiesel producers. Now I think that the Midwest biodiesel guys haven't been doing as well as renewable diesel, and you've seen a little bit, although not as much as anybody expected, capacity rationalization in that industry. And you've seen the RD guys really kind of pick up the slack, and then on top of that, RD imports sort of picking up the slack. Now the imports have gone away, and so you do still have the demand that should be stronger than it has been traditionally. You've also had the expansion in the mandates, so it should be higher than it has been, but I don't know that we're going to get all of the soybean oil allocated to feedstock that USDA suggests we're going to. One of the things that will be important, just to circle it back to weather, will be the temperatures and rainfall over the pod filling, because not only do they determine the yield, but they also determine oil content in the seed. And now we're running at 11.7 or 11.8 almost, 11.77, 11.78, 11.79, somewhere in there, kind of consistently year over year. And any shortfall, I used to assume 11.5. Any shortfall in yield would make that tighter. Beyond all of that, we get the next iteration of the EPA's EMTS data, the RIN generation data, on Thursday. The June data showed that essentially the industry needs to operate at full capacity over the last 6 months of the year to meet the mandate. So, and traditionally the average is 66% capacity utilization.
Last year was a disaster.
Oh,
last year was like hovering at 50. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. So if you look at the chart, it's just the monthly chart of production is like, it's like a big U. No, that's kind of assuming that we don't import anything, but imports have really fallen off and have only started to come back. And so I say that to say that even if I am right and the number is closer to my number or even below my number than USDA suggests, I would also say that the second half of the year is probably going to be just generally a lot tighter in the feedstock markets than the first half of the year, because you're going to have this, even if they produce at 90% of capacity, it's going to be well above what they traditionally have. And the undifferentiated advanced, or the amount of D4 that may be required to meet the overall mandate and the advanced mandate that isn't part of the biomass-based diesel mandate, is about 400 million gallons plus or minus. And so that's another 3.1 billion pounds of feedstock on top of whatever you would calculate just from the mandate. So my number is oddly below the USDA. That feels like an odd place to be, but I literally had a hard time getting it up to the USDA, let alone sort of a billion pounds above USDA, which is where I would normally be. But it's in part because of the shift that we've had in policy, and I think it's in part also a little bit because we probably have a bit better numbers today than I've had in the past on what non-biofuel is and what they actually will and can do.
Okay, thanks, man. Let's move forward because we still have 20 minutes. Let's move forward. Actually, let's move south to South America, and let me use my accent to on the best way that I can use it. Well, so yeah, we are just, the South American crop is just around the corner. There's this crop this year. It will be an interesting season for a couple of reasons. So we had this. So in the U.S., one of the impacts of the war was on fertilizers price. We saw urea going from $400 per ton on pre-war to nearly $700 per ton in April. it eased back to pre-war levels at the moment, but it's still, and U.S. farmers were safe on that price rally because they already had locked it in their costs. So this price increase would land in South American farmers. Um, it has eased, but it's still margins are compressed. And believe me or not, there are some people saying, I've heard from local agencies, but not only local agencies, but international organizations like Rebel Bank, claiming that Brazilian acreage would on soy would move sideways on the compounding effect of the compression of margins and El Nino. So El Nino, what happens in El Nino years? It's not a major disruptive event, but what it usually does, it makes South America, the south of South America, a little bit wetter. So Argentina, Rio Grande do Sul, the second largest producing state in Brazil, they're kind of safe. But when you move to the center west, where most of the production is concentrated, uh, usually the rainfall tends to get a little bit late. So farmers at the moment are expecting to get their rainfall to start their planting their crops by mid September, and usually that we have a delay on that rainfall. So we have this compounding events that my I don't really buy Brazil moving its acreage sideways, but one because we had like some in the past years, especially when we had this margins bonanza in 2020, 2021, and 20 up to 2022 before the Russian Ukrainian war. A lot of farmers invested in new areas, so the areas that they bought in 2022, they had to open this new area, condition the soil, so they will plant anyways. And with that said, I'm not expecting acres to move sideways, but I also don't really expect Brazil adding another 1.5 million hectares as it has been doing for the past decade. I would say, I don't know. So I would expect like a marginal increase on acreage, um, on the Brazilian acreage. Argentina will stay as it is. I don't really expect any major change. But the one thing that is interesting and worth highlighting in this chart, and that our climate read is getting, is corn. The safrinha is the major point of concern for the Brazilian campaign, and that is because we have the safrinha is it accounts for more than 70% of the total corn production in Brazil. It is completely located in the center west. That is a little bit in southern Brazil, but most of the safrinha is planted in Mato Grosso, and that region has a climate pattern that makes this crop really sensitive into the planting calendar. And as we can see it, our climate models are already printing a significant increase on the dry stress risk on the planning window of safrinha. And as you can see it on this chart on your right, you can see that El Nino really picks up the risks of on the planning window. With that said, we have the demand layer. Oh, sorry. We have the demand layer also not going anywhere anytime soon in Brazil, mostly boosted by biofuels. Um, so we have the US as a marginal supplier for corn, and Brazil has more than two-thirds of its crop under El Nino risk. That are material risks that even if El Nino doesn't really hit too hard, the supply will feel the impact of moving a little bit forward that planning window on corn. Do you expect any major impacts on the global markets with this? Like I don't really see major events coming stemming from the delaying of the planning window, but I'm curious to hear your opinion. What we should expect for, especially on corn.
In corn, the you're exactly right. The safrinha crop has the most trouble with El Nino because it delays soybean planting, and so then the soybean crop gets harvested a little bit later. The rainy season in center west Brazil is very much a light switch, and when it stops raining, whether corn is filling or not. And so pushing that back always makes everybody nervous about sort of the end of season finish for the safrinha crop. And I do think that that El Nino, kind of like we were talking about before, there have been a lot of stories in the news and social media about El Nino and it's coming and in the impacts. I think the last La Nina is probably really illustrative for how these events work in the ag markets, in that you can have an El Nino or a La Nina, and a lot of people will think that that means yields automatically fall that year, and that might be true. But there is context around that, and it depends a little bit more on what the soil moisture looks like coming in. And so if you look at Argentina, so just to make things really simple, it's much simpler than they actually are. El Nino generally drier in northern South America, La Nina generally drier in southern South America. So the La Nina dried Argentina out. It was a multi-year La Nina. It lasted 2.5, 3 years. If you go back and you look at the yields and you look at the impact of La Nina or El Nino on yields in the first year that it occurs, it's surprisingly small. But if you look at it, if you have a multi-year, then whatever the impacts are tend to get exaggerated. And so in Argentina in 2023, their crop dropped to 25 million tons, which is roughly a 50% cut in yield, which is really, really hard to do, given what we're talking about before in seed technology. And it basically didn't rain in Argentina almost for an entire year, it felt like. And so because of the El Nino itself, I don't know that you get the market to react to that right now. But if the El Nino is persistent and you do start to see more reports out of Mato Grosso and Center West about dryness and concerns, then I think you might be able to have it. A lot of it will depend on when farmers can start planting soybeans next month, right? If they can plant them right on the 15th and get going then there will be less concern about it. If they have to wait longer, there will be more concern about it. But I think even with that, you're going to get better, in theory, better conditions in Argentina that would help shut off a little bit of the losses, although the Center West is getting so big right now, it's almost impossible for somebody else to lose it.
Yeah, I'm with you. Let's move forward to the demand side of it and to be time conscious because we still have 10 minutes and there are a couple of questions on the chat. So let's just wrap up on this slide, giving a little bit of colors on the demand side of the Brazilian beans market and what is going to be the impact on the global markets. So I have been talking about the Brazilian biofuel industry in the past years, and the way that I see it is Brazil and not only the current administration, but the previous administration as well, it sees the biofuels as a route to put it back, to put the Brazilian economy back to the industrialization track. So it's interesting because it's something that both the right parties and the left parties agrees that we have to step away a bit of being just a raw exporter, but actually process and try to capture the value, most of the value chain from the biofuel industry. And that's happened. In 2024, the Brazilian Congress approved the Fuels of the Future bill, which is the biggest framework of the biofuel policy in the past 50 years, which basically paves the way to steady and consistent biodiesel mandates increase. Right now, we are at a B15 mandate, but not only that, but also establishing mandates on the advanced biofuels like renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel as well. So the impacts of that were already felt, like especially in 2024, when Brazil jumped from the B12 to the B14 biodiesel mandate. We saw our soy oil exports tanking 40% in a year, and it hasn't moved back above 2 million tons per year. And I don't see anytime soon that happening. Actually, Brazil will become more and more of a closed domestic market. And if we actually follow that futures the fuel of the future bill that establishes that we should reach to a B20 mandate by 2030, and on top of that we'll have the renewable diesel and the SAF mandate kicking in next year. Brazil could become even like an importer of soybean oil. I don't really expect Brazil to become like a huge importer of veg oil. That would be really, really weird. But with that said, that means that we're going virtually to zero exports and become more and more of a domestic market. And what that means for us is that so we have Brazil withdrawing itself from the global markets, US also zeroing its exports on bean oil. So who we have left? Argentina, and these guys are stepping in to fill up this gap that these countries are leaving. And this chart, I think, is quite visual illustrative for that. That's the exports gap, and that's Argentina establishing more and more its position as a global supplier. Do you think that's gonna be the case? Is Argentina? Do you see any pivot in that trajectory from Argentina, Brazil, and the U.S.?
No, I think that's right. I think Brazil and Argentina, or Brazil and the US, like you say, probably increasingly get more domestically focused. I used to show a US soybean oil balance sheet that had 5 billion pounds of imports. And I never really thought that the US would import that much, but that was what I used to highlight the gap. I would tell people that's how much feedstock we actually don't have that we were going to need. And I do think there may be a little bit more of an opportunity for Brazil to, I know every country always wants to move all the way down the end of the value chain and export the fuel, not the feedstock. But I do think a little bit of it will depend on how countries shape their policy in the coming years. But I think most governments may find that their fuel plans outrun their feedstock realities, I guess, right? So if you look at what projected feedstock demand is going to be in 5 years or 10 years or whatever, it much like your Brazilian balance sheet, my old soybean oil balance sheet, it shows that it's very tough and feedstocks remain very tight. Now, we could have something like camelina oil or carnita or some of these other sort of feedstocks 2.0 kind of things come in, but the elimination of the ILUC on soybean oil really puts a damper in those, right? Now,
Yeah.
instead of the CI benefit, and you'll still get the CI benefit for like the California market, and I'm sure other governments will set their policy up in similar ways. But it's not quite the same. And so now it's really relying on farmers, either it generating enough value or farmers really wanting to take advantage of the cover crop that also has the bonus of a bunch of seeds that you can turn into oil. But I think that it seemed to me that the Brazilian industries, whereas the Brazilian industries that produce the feedstocks are as interested in exporting those feedstocks as they are selling them domestically and turning them into fuel, right? So
Want it all.
yes, in Brazil, maybe the country that can do it all. Right? It's big enough and it's getting productive enough that it really could be the ag superpower if it kind of flexed its muscles a little bit and logistically improved some. Then it really could do it all. But I think to your point, I think probably in the short term and probably the path of least resistance is concentrate on domestic production and domestic biofuel production and domestic grain and oilseed and veg oil consumption. And then if there is stuff left and other governments aren't sort of penalizing imported feedstock, then Brazil will be right there to capture it, I think. Because outside of soybean oil, what is Argentina going to export? They can't do all, I mean, not a ton of tallow, not a ton of choice white grease or that kind of stuff. And not that people love using choice white grease in biomass-based diesel production, but I think those opportunities in particular are really open for Brazilian exporters, again, as long as the importing countries get on the other side. One thing that I will say about the world's reaction to exports of biofuels, and it's all based on what Argentina did in the early 2000s, or not what Argentina did, but the world's reaction to what Argentina did, I guess, in the 2000s and 2010, where there were a bunch of WTO cases and all kinds of trade actions against Argentina. I think a little bit Brazilian fuel exports will have to deal with some of the residual of that, not from they've done something wrong as much as this is a competitive hammer we can beat them over the head with kind of thing. And so there probably will be a little bit more friction than there should be.
We already have been dealing with that, not on the fuels and feedstocks arena, but on the Mercosur and the EU agreement. European farmers are not happy at all having a free trade agreement with South America because of Brazil, and I think we'll feel some backlash as well on the other markets. Let me shoot one question, being time sensitive because we just have 1 minute, so it is a yes and no question.
Okay.
You have to
yes and
keep
no.
sharp. Yes and no, and a little bit more. But this is an interesting question for our audience. If you were a buyer, would you be locking anything on beans right now, or would you wait for the end of the US crop and maybe the start of the South American crop?
It would depend
sharp and quickly.
It would depend almost daily on the weather forecast. As long as the weather forecast is good, I would wait. If the weather forecast across the Corn Belt turns hot and dry, then I would get more active rather than less active in buying. Yeah,
so keep an eye on our climate signals, guys, because Helios is where you will find the best ones.
Absolutely. Really appreciate you having me, Joao. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Tori. It was a pleasure having you. I hope you all enjoyed this conversation. Please, if you have any more questions, feel free to shoot us an email. Shoot me an email at joão.morciani@helios.sc. It was a pleasure having you guys, and I see you all on next month's webinar. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.